Okay, before we start, I need to tell you something. If you followed me before this podcast, you probably already know that I have questions about this case. A lot of them. And I'm not going to pretend that I'm coming into this completely neutral. I've publicly talked about the theories surrounding Patrick Clancy. I've talked about the things in this case that don't sit right with me. And yes, I've questioned whether the story we've been given is actually the full story. But there's also a difference between having a theory and proving one. And throughout this podcast, I want to be very careful about that. When something is a fact, I'll tell you it's a fact. When something comes from Patrick, I'll tell you it comes from Patrick. When something comes from Lindsay, the prosecution, or the defense, I'll tell you that too. And when I'm giving my own opinion, you'll know. Because there are things about this case that I genuinely cannot explain. And that's exactly why I called this podcast Unanswered Questions. Most of you know how this story ends. January 24th, 2023. Duxbury, Massachusetts. Patrick Clancy comes home after running errands. He finds his wife, Lindsay, outside the house after apparently jumping from a second-story window. Inside are their 3 children, 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 8-month-old Callan. All 3 children would die. Lindsay survived this, and she would eventually be charged with murdering them. That's the story most of us were introduced to. But we're not starting there. Because I've spent so much time looking at January 24th that eventually I realized something. I knew the crime, but I didn't know the people. Who was Lindsay before January 24th? Who was Patrick? What was their marriage actually like? What kind of mother was Lindsay? What kind of father was Patrick? And how do 2 seemingly ordinary people end up at the center of a case this horrific? So today, we're going back. Before she married Patrick and became Lindsay Clancy, she was Lindsay Musgrove. She grew up in Wallingford, Connecticut. And honestly, if you're expecting me to tell you that Lindsay had this incredibly disturbing childhood and that there were warning signs everywhere, they really weren't. At least not from what we know currently. People who knew Lindsay when she was young have described her as a happy, energetic, and kind kid. She rode bikes around the neighborhood. She did gymnastics. She was a cheerleader. She did well in school. She was part of the National Honor Society. Basically, she sounded normal. And I know normal isn't a particularly exciting word, but in this case, I think it's actually important. Because after someone does something horrific like this, we have this tendency to go backwards through their entire life looking for clues. Suddenly, every childhood photograph looks different. Every personality trait becomes suspicious. Every old story becomes a warning sign. But sometimes, that's hindsight talking. And with Lindsay, I haven't found some obvious childhood event where you can point and say, there, that's where this started. After high school, Lindsay went to Quinnipiac University. She studied biology. She continued cheerleading. She made the dean's list. She graduated in 2012. And eventually, she decided that she wanted to become a nurse. Not just any nurse. Lindsay became a labor and delivery nurse. And there's something about that detail that I can't stop thinking about. Think about what that job actually means. Lindsay spent her working life helping women give birth, helping mothers, caring for women during their pregnancy and delivery, being around newborn babies. And by all accounts, she loved her job. Patrick would later describe nursing as her dream job, which makes where this story eventually goes almost impossible to reconcile with the person we're talking about right now. But before any of that, Lindsay met Patrick. So, who was Patrick? This is where things become interesting. Because when I started first looking into this case, almost everything naturally centered around Lindsay. Her medical records, her medications, her internet searches, her mental state, her journals, her behavior, and obviously all of that makes sense. She's the defendant. But I kept coming back to Patrick. Because Patrick isn't some random person standing on the edge of the story. He was there through almost all of it. He was Lindsay's husband. He was their father. He lived with her. He watched her mental health struggles, spoke with her about what she was experiencing. He was involved in the conversations about treatment. And on January 24th, he was the person who left the house shortly before everything happened. Patrick and Lindsay met around 2013. At the time, Lindsay was building her nursing career. Patrick would eventually work in technology. They started dating, They moved in together in Quincy, and from everything publicly available about this early period, their relationship seems pretty ordinary. No enormous scandal, no obvious history of violence that explains what comes later, no dramatic story about a marriage that everyone around them knows was falling apart. They were just Lindsay and Patrick, a young couple building their lives. They get married. In 2016, they married, and about a year later, they had their first child, Cora. There's actually a detail about Cora's name that I found really sweet. Patrick testified that she was named after a baby Lindsay helped to deliver while working as a nurse. And again, that's one of those details that makes this case difficult for me. Because we're talking about a woman whose entire identity seems to have been wrapped up in babies and motherhood. She helps deliver a baby, she loves the name. Years later, she gives the same name to her own daughter. And Cora wasn't just some abstract idea of motherhood for Lindsay. This was her little girl. Then in 2019, they had Dawson. And now, Lindsay and Patrick had 2 children. Eventually, they settled in Duxbury. 2 parents, 2 kids, careers, a home, normal family life. At least, that's what it looked like. What kind of parents were they? This is something I really wanted to understand. Because if Lindsay was secretly abusive towards these children before January 24th, where is that history? So far, that's not the picture Patrick himself has given us. Patrick has described Lindsay as an incredibly involved mother. She read to the children. She made up songs for them. She took them to activities. She kept track of things. She planned. She worried. She was involved. And apparently, the house itself reflected that. Their artwork was around. Their stickers were around. Their belongings were everywhere. This was very clearly a house with 3 children living inside of it. And Patrick has said something else that's incredibly important. Before January 24th, he says he never witnessed Lindsay physically harm their children. Think about that. Because Patrick had more access to Lindsay than almost anyone. He lived with her. He parented with her. He saw her when nobody else was around. And according to him, he hasn't seen her hurting these kids. Patrick also appears to have been a very involved father. Neighbors remembered him outside playing with the children. And that's important too, because I don't want this podcast to turn Patrick into a villain simply because I have questions about him. If evidence makes Patrick look good, I'm going to tell you. If evidence makes Lindsay look bad, I'm going to tell you that as well. I don't want to build a theory and then force every fact into it. I want to see whether the theory survives the facts. There's a huge difference. Then Callan came. In May 2022, Lindsay gave birth to their 3rd child, Callan. Now imagine this house. A 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a newborn. Anyone who has spent time around 3 young children knows how exhausting that can be. But something that's important here is that Lindsay didn't apparently fall apart immediately after giving birth. There was a period where things seemed to be okay. Patrick has described that summer as a good one for their family. They spent time together. They went to the beach. They traveled. They visited friends. Callan was reportedly a happy baby. But as summer ended and Lindsay's maternity leave moved closer to ending, something started changing. Lindsay became anxious, extremely anxious. She struggled to sleep. She became increasingly worried about herself as a mother. Was she connecting with Callan enough? Was she giving Cora and Dawson enough attention? Was she spending enough time with them? Was she being a good mother? And initially, none of that necessarily sounds alarming. A lot of parents worry they're not good enough, or worry they're not doing enough. A lot of mothers feel overwhelmed. But for Lindsay, those worries didn't go away. They got worse. And eventually, Lindsay realized that something was wrong. So she did what we're constantly telling people to do when they're struggling mentally. She asked for help. Lindsay tries to get help, and I think that is one of the most important parts of Lindsay's story. Because Lindsay didn't just sit at home while nobody knew anything was wrong. She was actively trying to get psychiatric help, again and again and again. She spoke to doctors. She saw psychiatric providers. She reported her anxiety. She talked about not sleeping. She talked about feeling disconnected. She talked about how certain medications were making her feel. And her treatment kept changing. One medication, then another, and another. Over a period of roughly 4 months, Lindsay was prescribed 13 different psychiatric medications by multiple providers. 13. That's a lot. Among the medications she was prescribed were Zoloft, Prozac, Ativan, Klonopin, Seroquel, and Lindsay herself was worried about some of them. She reportedly worried about becoming dependent to Ativan. She complained about how Prozac made her feel. At one point, she described feeling out of it, and still, she wasn't getting any better. That's what bothers me, because this isn't somebody refusing treatment. This is someone going through a treatment and continuing to deteriorate. She knew something was wrong. Her anxiety became more intense. The insomnia continued. She became increasingly focused on whether she was connecting properly with her children. She worried about how her depression might be affecting them. She experienced intrusive thoughts, and eventually, suicidal thoughts. There were points where Lindsay was essentially documenting what was happening to her. Her sleep, her medications, her symptoms, how she felt, and I think there's something incredibly sad about that. Because when you look at it now, you know where the story is going. She didn't. She was trying to figure out what was happening inside of her own head, and here is where this case gets complicated. Some of the professionals who treated Lindsay have testified that they didn't observe signs of psychosis. That's important, because if we're going to talk about postpartum psychosis later, we can't pretend every doctor was saying it. They weren't. But that doesn't mean they thought Lindsay was completely fine either. They didn't have a patient with postpartum psychosis before Lindsay. I think that's why they didn't see the symptoms. There was anxiety, insomnia, depression, intrusive thoughts, suicidal thoughts. Something was clearly wrong with her. The disagreement is over exactly what that was, but the pattern fits with postpartum psychosis. At some point during all of this, Lindsay tried to access something even more specific. A program designed for women experiencing postpartum mental health problems. She was referred to a specialized postpartum treatment through Women and Infants Hospital in Rhode Island. And she wasn't admitted. This part is complicated, and we're going to come back to it when we do a deeper dive episode about her medical treatments. But testimony has raised concerns about the amount of medication Lindsay has been prescribed and whether the different people treating her actually had the complete picture. And when I first started reading about this part, I just kept thinking, how many people were involved here? Because Lindsay is seeing different providers, different medications are being prescribed, a specialized postpartum program becomes involved. There are concerns about her medication. And at this point, providers apparently didn't have complete information about what other providers were prescribing. So who was actually overseeing all of this? Who knew everything Lindsay was taking? Who knew everything she was reporting? Did anyone have the full picture? We don't know. But those are questions I think matter, especially because Lindsay continued getting worse. December. By December, this was no longer simply anxiety about returning to work. Things had become much darker. On December 15th, Lindsay reported persistent and intrusive suicidal thoughts. And just hearing that changes the way I look at this timeline. Because we're not talking about I'm overwhelmed. We're talking about I don't want to be here. And Patrick knew about at least some of what was happening. But here's the confusing part. Lindsay could tell Patrick something terrifying, and then shortly after, seem normal. She could make lunch, take care of the children, talk normally, do normal mom things, and be the perfect mother. Patrick has described exactly these contradictions. And he has said that despite knowing Lindsay was struggling, he had never actually seen her physically harm the children. So imagine being Patrick. Your wife tells you she's having a terrifying thought. Then you watch her go back to being the woman you've known for almost 10 years. What do you believe? How seriously do you take the thoughts? Do you believe your children are actually in danger? And allegedly, no one took Lindsay seriously. Patrick didn't, the doctors didn't, and Lindsay herself may not have understood what was happening to her. Things became serious enough that outpatient treatment wasn't enough for her. Around New Year's 2023, Lindsay was admitted to McLean Hospital for inpatient psychiatric treatment, a psychiatric hospital. Patrick has testified that Lindsay was scared and didn't want to go. She stayed there for several days. And think about the progression we've seen for a minute. A few months earlier, the family is spending summer together. Then Lindsay starts experiencing anxiety, then insomnia, then psychiatric appointments happen, then medication, more medication, different providers, intrusive thoughts, suicidal thoughts, an attempt to access the specialized postpartum care, and eventually, hospitalization. This is not a small change. Something had changed dramatically. And on January 5th, 2023, Lindsay was discharged from McLean. She went home. But this is where I want to stop, because I don't want what happens next to change the way we look at everything we've just talked about. Not yet. For this episode, I wanted us to meet Lindsay before she became a headline, and Patrick before he became a central figure in one of the most discussed cases in the country. There was a marriage. There were 3 children. There was a career Lindsay loved. There were ordinary summers and family trips and toys scattered around the house. And then, after Callan was born, something began to change. Lindsay recognized it. Doctors were involved. Psychiatric providers were involved. Medication after medication was tried. Lindsay attempted to access specialized postpartum treatments. And eventually, she ended up inside McLean Hospital. Whatever you ultimately believe about this case, I think that's important. Because Lindsay didn't wait until something catastrophic happened before seeking help. She had been asking for it, again and again and again. And still, by January 2023, she had changed enough to require inpatient psychiatric care. So for tonight, that's where we're leaving Lindsay. January 5th, 2023. Discharged from McLean Hospital. Back home with Patrick. Back home with her babies, Cora, Dawson, and Callan. And still trying to understand what was happening to her, what was happening to her mind. There are 19 days between Lindsay leaving McLean and the date that would change this family's story forever. But those 19 days deserve their own attention. Because we have to know what happened after Lindsay came home. What did her doctors believe when they discharged her? What was Patrick told? What was Lindsay telling him? What was Patrick telling Lindsay? What was happening inside their home? Did Lindsay seem better? Did she seem worse? And were there warning signs that only became obvious afterwards? Those questions belong to the next part of this story. For now, I want to leave you with just one. Lindsay had recognized that something was wrong. She sought psychiatric help. She saw multiple providers. She tried numerous medications. She tried to access specialized postpartum care. And eventually, she was hospitalized. So when Lindsay walked out of McLean on January 5th, was she actually ready to come home? I'm Hannah, and this is Unanswered Questions.